Good afternoon and welcome to the final Visiting Artist Series presentation of 2020. My name is Justin Whitty and I am the Director and Curator of the Cleve Carney Museum of Art. Before we start today, I'd like to mention a few things. The Visiting Artist Series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the Fine Art, Photography, and Architecture programs here at the College of DePaul. With that in mind, I'd like to acknowledge the outstanding work of the faculty on the Visiting Artist Series committee, who have had to adapt to putting our entire program online this year. That, of course, would have been impossible without the help of Paul Thompson and everyone in the Multimedia Services Department. So I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge all of the work that they have done this year. Today, we are extremely fortunate to be able to hear from two amazing guests, Darby English and Ayanah Moore. Ayanna Moore is an artist who lives and works in Chicago. And through her paintings, prints, drawings, and performance, Moore operates within a visual field where notions of blackness and gender identity take shape. She utilizes existing material and cultural artifacts to generate alternative histories, often repositioning the subject as a corrective gesture or to create counter-narratives. Moore received her BFA from the Virginia Commonwealth University and her Master's in Fine Arts from the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. She has exhibited her work at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the DePaul Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, and the Studio Museum in Harlem, among others. Leading the conversation today with Ayanna, we are extremely fortunate to have the art historian, writer, and curator, Darby English. Darby English is the Carl Darling Buck Professor of Art History and director of the Shearer Center for the Study of American Culture at the University of Chicago. His scholarship focuses on ways that fine art and popular culture produced since 1964 have prepared us to welcome or reject the passing of difference as we have known it. For those of you watching on our YouTube channel, please feel free to join us in the live chat. Ayanna will be joining us to answer your questions, and Darby may be joining us as well. Today, we're going to start off with Ayanna presenting some of her work, and then the discussion will be led from Darby at that point. So again, welcome to both of you, and I'd like to hand things off to you, Ayanna.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. I should thank you in particular, Justin, for your support of my work. And this conversation is in many ways an introduction to the forthcoming exhibition. And I appreciate your commitment to seeing that through. And I remain really excited about that show. Also, thanks to the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the College of DuPage for hosting this event, and also to Darby English for accepting the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to transition to sharing my screen. I want to start my presentation with this image. It's documentation of a work entitled Thanks for the Race from 2014. The photograph depicts a dirt road that leads to a house at the rear of the scene. There's a smaller building, possibly a shelter located at the center, and to the right is a tall pole that displays two posters. The bottom poster has a black square with openings that form letters. Words are in 3 rows that read from top to bottom, thanks, in the second row, for the, and the third row, race. This image records what might be an encounter between an individual traveling along this road and the poster. And while the message is a declarative statement, the text poses questions. Who is being thanked? What is the race? It also implies possibly that an event has already occurred. The image records this encounter, and I'm interested conceptually and materially in artworks that mimic or build upon everyday activities. I find those very appealing. Such works expose the value of art in society over everyday actions. These artworks reposition value whether read as devaluing art or elevating mundane acts. The question of who might be regarded as an artist opens, impacting the perception of an artist's training or status or materials and tools. Richard Long's A Line Made by Walking is literally evidence of this process. A photograph of a field of grass depicts a path of folded blades produced by walking. If a drawing is defined as the evidence of things that touch, how might that new meaning expand the tools and methods used to create a drawing? The result might yield something more subtle and poetic. How might walking be expanded as an opportunity to create new meaning and making? David Hammond's Blizzard Ball Sale 1 similarly relies on this familiar action. The vendor operates within a situation of exchange. There's an understanding between the vendor and the prospective buyer. Hammond's mimics this arrangement, but the materials, their careful craftsmanship and arrangement shifts the meaning. Time-based melting, meticulously sized snowballs, and a thoughtful composition convey value and care. Thanks for the Race is informed by these types of gestures. A time-based, site-specific work made with materials sourced from the grounds of an artist's residency. A damaged silkscreen and leftover ink found in the residency print shop were used to create a silkscreen print. The prints were posted around the residency campus with no explanation as to their meaning or who performed the act. A day later, I composed a short racing course with materials collected from the residency grounds, including rubber mats, stumps of wood, rocks, and my own body near the main lodge. And then I randomly challenged resident artists to participate in a short sprint along the race course. After seeing the posters, some residents seemed relieved that this piece wasn't about race at all. Interestingly, a few people who had no knowledge of my athletic ability joked that they knew that I, as a Black person, was fast. Some said that they knew I was going to win. And as people gathered to witness, participants and onlookers cheered. Some artists waited their turn to race me, and a competitive spirit was on display. For their participation, I offered the artists a rock from the grounds as a gift. Thanks for the Race allowed me to explore the landscape of the artist residency. It also encouraged play and competition within the context of an artist colony. It allowed for subversive readings of race and athleticism, race and raced. I was interested in confrontation and vulnerability and gender identity interpreted through sport. I wanted to extend the art making opportunity with the residency public and conjure the history of race as a social construct and popular athletic competition. The use of text in my work is often a play upon words, inviting the reader, viewer to engage in the construction of meaning. Whether appropriating existing texts or messages I've authored, I'm drawn to statements that question, interrupt, or expand meaning. My work often engages subversive and demonstrative displays of Blackness that locate love, fear, myth, and desire. For me, text as image is a form of making that combines painting and language. My approach considers the paper as a space where content begins. Starting with a palette that is brown is intentional, building upon words with an inverted painting process where the space around each letter activates the marginal space, the Blackness that makes the letter visible. I am equally interested in mysticism and the myth-making or currency of Blackness. What does it mean to acknowledge culture? What does it mean to acknowledge culture made in the most tragic of circumstances, what does it mean to make as an act of liberation? I'm also interested in how love might be depicted and what the space of loving looks like. In Armstead and Marina 2016, this print work showcases a house with various layers of ink covering its surface. Pinks and yellows bring color to a gray building. Splotches and stains mask and highlight. Red crayon charges the surface, adding energy to the image. The small building is located behind Bracebridge Hall in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, the home of former Governor Elias Carr. Bracebridge Hall has been designated a historic landmark, a plantation that includes a small house where my ancestors lived. In order for me to be here, this site, despite the terror of enslavement, the horror of not having possession of one's own body, of servitude and bondage, must have also held love. It is my belief, it is my view, that I would not be alive if the people who lived in this house did not choose love. In this work, I strip the prescriptive narrative tied to this image and focus on the will to reimagine my relationship to this house and its history. What does love look like? How might I uncouple a narrative of oppression towards a space of freedom to imagine and create? To represent my story. This work gave me permission to revisit painting. In this talk, I view this as an opportunity, a space to build upon an emerging language rather than to assert a fixed language. I'm thinking about my paintings as a site of building form and destabilizing it, of painting in relationship to print media, of architecture in relationship to fluidity, as measured and considered in relation to gestural and improvisational. And in this painting, there are layers and marks that are in dialogue with this printed element that's extended in a very precarious way. I'm curious about the relationship that the viewer develops, or the reading of a relationship between the printed and the painted, and also the implication of the ad as this space of entrepreneurial pursuit, and also makeup as a practice that might be tied to painting. What it means,
Actually,
yeah.
I'm sorry, Ayanna. I just wanted to, for the sake of the viewer, I know this ad that you've used, so I want to just point out that the "someone you know" in your title,
Yes,
is the beginning of the tagline. "Someone you know sells Avon."
that's right.
Just to bring out the detail of the entrepreneurial appeal in the ad that you're appropriating in so many interesting ways. I'll save my I'll save my thoughts about it, but I just wanted to, yeah, because people watching on Zoom or whatever may not see what you have extracted out of that ad as clearly as someone who recognizes the ad.
That's right. That's right. No, I appreciate that. That is one of the ways in which I'm interested in kind of indexing this use of the word "you" is very interesting to me, and that it sets up a situation for the viewer to think about their relationship to the ad, the kind of intergenerational display in the ad, and possibly one's relationship to painting. And so I'm very curious about questions of what it means to make something renderable as or of Blackness, and also to not make Blackness renderable. So I'm finding that there is a tension in the way that I'm approaching painting, that I in fact want a kind of difficulty sometimes. And it's informed by the challenge that emerged as I thought about the image of the house, and what I want to be engaged in thinking about that space with a kind of complexity that allows for love to be in that space. So just thinking about the kind of wall of these Black strokes and the kind of interference that interrupts an engagement with the colors underneath become a kind of formal thing and a metaphor for me. I feel it necessary to point to someone like Alma Thomas, both because I'm very fascinated by her kind of biography as this first graduate of Howard University's art program, but also as an educator for many years who would then be quite focused on painting after retirement. And my read of, or my understanding of the way that these paintings developed are as much about looking out of the window of her home and seeing the light or the sky between the trees, as it is to think about the space beyond that, or outer space. So I remain really, I feel an affirmation, and I feel a kind of kinship, humbly in relation to my kind of biography as an educator, but also my interest and my kind of interest in painting, or some of my earlier training. The quality of a kind of architecture and a fluidity is kind of a tension that plays out in some of these works, where literally there is a kind of push and pull that's happening with the space that I create in the painting, and how that is made visible on the surface. And in this work, similar to the dynamic that I create with this precarious arm that holds the Someone You Know vintage ad, is also at work in this one image of a woman's hair within an ad that is also talking about the body and talking about aesthetics and a preference for a particular kind of hair texture or type or style. And it becomes this space that I can then explore in a more expansive way within the surface of the painting.
Could I ask a question about that vintage magazine page?
Yes.
Is there any copy on that page? Are there any words?
They've been trimmed away.
Okay.
There was also the product itself has been trimmed, and the ad has been trimmed.
Okay.
So similar to in other works, I'm inspired by the readings, the implications of the ad, but also the palette, and then the kind of texture, this kind of shift between ragged and smooth, seemed to also propel the ways that I approach the painting. There's also become a kind of scenario where I've created this relationship between two paintings that are a kind of diptych, although they're not the same size or attached, that creates a kind of entry point into the painting, or a back and forth between the larger painting and the smaller painting. And I continue to approach this as a process in which I'm learning from what I'm doing, as much as I'm interested in a kind of setup that I want to explore in these paintings. So these diagonals, I view as a kind of architecture that I then interrupt or bring ornament to that there's something about this kind of resistance and then this kind of navigating around that conceptually is really influencing how I approach the paintings compositionally. Initially in my studio, I was working at different scales, and I found that I started to enjoy the relationship between things, and that led me to keep them together as one piece, although they're two works.
So what was the relationship in time in which these were created? Were they created simultaneously or subsequent to each other, or something else and then brought together later?
I would refer to it as simultaneous, but
Cool.
not living next to one another.
Right.
So the smaller painting was on another wall in my studio, and
Nice.
And they started to come together. And some of that I suspect has to do with palette, or some residue from one moment of working to the other, that began to kind of draw them together.
What's really fascinating about the way you describe that is that, like, one of those palette is very concrete, and it's the kind of thing that we could observe if we had the proximity and the patience and the vocabulary of perception to see where the palettes touch. And I can begin to see that here. But that other thing that you described, where some residue of the production, that's a very personal, private perception that you might be the only living soul with access to, right? There's like something that happens between you and the form and the other form, and the space between them in the room, and the space between you and them in the room. And it's really nice to hear a narration of their relationship that is equal parts concrete. You too can participate in this, like Mr. Viewer, stranger person, and something extremely, I don't want to call it abstract because that's not the right word for what you're describing, but it's much more immaterial than something that I could use my art looking skills to identify and track and describe and theorize. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to underline that for people who might be following us.
I should say that although I can't necessarily zoom in right now, there are small elements of collage. The top left, there is kind of a pointing the landscape. There's some plants and flower and imagery that's under the surface.
Yeah, I can see it sort of between that red and white passage and the yellow swirly passage.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And there's somewhat of a representation of that flower in the lower right, that has a little bit of texture that seems to push through the swipes that kind of knock it back in the lower right. And I think I just have maybe two more. I also have been thinking about Ralph Arnold.
I love Ralph.
So do I. I had the great fortune of being a part of the companion exhibition. There was a fantastic show that the Museum of Contemporary Photography put on of Ralph Arnold's work, and there was a companion show called Echoes Reframing Collage. And I, like Alma Thomas, I felt such connection with with his personal story, and just so excited by the range of the work. And that's something that, for some, the fact that my work takes different shape, it can be difficult to see connection, and for others the thread is the content, and the form changes. And so I really appreciate that about his practice and just how prolific he was. And both of these artists, little recognized in their time, and such significant production and such a contribution. So I'm really kind of wowed by him, learning about him more recently. Diamond's lead in the game, get in the game, is also kind of a play, that where I think being in awe of someone like Arnold starts to kind of show up a little bit. But as I kind of wrestle with, again, my relationship to these ads and thinking about a kind of currency of Blackness, but also the ways in which I can kind of be complicit in some of that, and wanting to kind of make that struggle, kind of translate that struggle into this kind of formal device, and trying to kind of pour everything that interests me about painting into one painting. So sometimes that yields something that for me is even sometimes difficult to kind of parse out and to look at. And in other areas, I'm very excited by the struggle. I find that struggle, again, is the struggle with this kind of renderable Blackness that I was talking about earlier. So the materials are listed there. I should say that there's a kind of vintage printed element on the top right, a woman's face that's very, very masked by a lot of the surface, and then a more contemporary ad that is connected by this red and black bar on the
top right.
lower
Can
left.
you help us see the one at top right? Is it in that circle that's partly exposed? Oh,
Can you see
there.
can you see the cursor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes.
there's an image there.
Okay, that one's really hard to capture for me. So that's a vintage magazine page that's been kind of
that's actually
redacted.
from an album.
Oh, it says album cover. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we meant to know what album it is? Or
It's
really?
it's the kind of thing that maybe comes out in this context, but to me is not like a prerequisite. I mean, it is an image of Roberta Flack.
Oh, it is. Okay.
But it's also just an image of a Black woman smiling. And then the lower.
Got it. Interesting.
She's not smiling.
She's not smiling.
The lower ad, the woman is not
ad.
smiling. That's right.
Right. I see.
Right.
Is that Roberta Flack? Is that the Roberta Flack of A Quiet Fire?
You know what? I'm so thinking about the image that now the title is escaping me, but
okay.
It's a Donny Hathaway and Roberta Flack.
Okay.
Collaboration, and they're both in the photograph.
I'm just going to say a couple of the things that struck me, and
Sure.
maybe you can pick the ones that respond, or that you have some response to.
Okay.
Pieces of language was a thought that I have.
Pieces of language.
Pieces of language. Yeah, the way that you described in the first image of Thanks for the Race, like when it's on the pole next to the cupola on the ground with the house in the background.
Yes.
But you described the piece line by line. Thanks, and then on the next line, for the, and then race on the third line. And it was like having it broken down, like having something so seemingly simple broken down, made it in that way by your voicing, and like made it clear that I meant to see. Like one thing that I meant to see is the pieces that make up language, statements, messages, signs. Like you want me to see and experience the pieces like as they come, because it's kind of as they come that I register or don't register each of the meanings that each word brings along with it. So it's a phrase that can have 3 or 4 different meanings, if and only if a listener is attuned to the context in which the words are appearing, the way they appear, the space between them, and every time a new slide appeared, I saw pieces and fragments and parts being thought about and rendered, composed, or set into compositions in yet another way. So at the end, I got to this idea of the part pattern, because we see a lot of patterns and decorations, motifs in your work, decorative motifs that appear, but they never become all over situations, right? It's like an all over situation that's been partly dismantled or somehow hasn't been able to fully accomplish itself. So even the part pattern is something that I'm thinking by the time we get to the end. And the part of Richard Long's piece that you stressed, which I'd never thought about before in connection to the line made by walking, was touch. Like you talked about the touch between, I forgot your word, I think maybe like bent blades.
Right.
You talk
folded.
Folded blades. Thank you. Even better. So take a piece of paper, whole piece of paper. And when you fold a piece of paper, it's suddenly a part of the initial sheet. I fold it again. I have a new part. And, there's just a lot of parts and parting and parsing, and taking objects and multiplying them, as it were. Is that something that you think about consciously, or am I just responding to formal traits that happen that suggest linkages to the subjects that you're interested in talking to us about?
Well, the part that interests me most is the kind of suggestion or kind of questioning of how intentional these kind of recurring motifs or elements. I love the way that you talked about parts and parting and parsing. If anything, I'm interested in a kind of knowing that is maybe not bound to language, in which I can kind of claim to know in a particular kind of way. I mean, I think there is a kind of knowing that is happening because I am interested in a kind of complexity that allows for rendering that otherwise is reductive. And so I think that I'm at a point in my work in which I'm not afraid of a certain level of a kind of conscious complexity, for lack of a better word. I think that's where these elements are kind of vying for position, but not becoming a thing, or suggestions. I feel like I'm at a stage in which that premise is much more exciting. And some of that for me is trusting that the viewer is along the ride as far as the kind of content that can come from the experience of looking at the work.
When you say along for the ride, I looked back at the painting in front of us. Oh, actually, not that one.
Should I go back?
No. But well, like you just said, get in that the title of the previous work is get in the game. And I've been thinking a lot about that part of observation and viewing recently, like the part of being a good observer that involves getting with the work on its own terms, even if that means laying your knowing down, which is a way that I found myself writing about it earlier in the summer, walking up to a painting by, like a young Black artist, and like thinking, because that's the moment we're in. So, chances are you're going to do that more often. That opportunity is thankfully finally more available than it was even 5 years ago. But when there's so much of it going on, it poses a risk to art if people are going around thinking they know what it means to walk up to the work of a young Black artist doing whatever. They have to lay everything they know down in order to see what's in front of them. So like when I say when I say lay my knowing down, I mean I have to do that as a precondition for getting into the game. So like you say, get in the game. I say, okay, but I gotta lay my knowing down first, because otherwise I'm bringing my game to your game, which is not how we play this game. It's even important to do it when you come to things that you think you know. It's maybe more important when it's a work of art that or it's a book or a poem or a musician or a TV show or a movie that you've been watching or looking at for a long time because you love it. At a certain point, you can stop noticing the qualities that make it what it is because you're coming for your hit of whatever it is that you go to it for. So tell us what's going on in front of us right now. I love Starburst.
Choose with a Z.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there is of course the kind of pointing to the palette of that popular candy, but also thinking about the difference in popularity between within certain communities between the candy and the actual fruit.
Yep.
And so there's something about that I'm kind of interested in, that kind of inside joke or humor. And then there are these elements that have a reference to kind of the landscape or nature, and then these kind of abstractions of that, so that these little, these kind of geometric moments, these kind of green sections start to, for me, echo the collaged element.
Yep.
And just the kind of push and pull, the screen and the kind of looking through kind of what's on top, those things just become really fun to explore in the painting.
Yeah, they really are. And right now, as you talk about like fun to explore, I think about how, as I look at it and listen to you, I see that chevron situation that starts in the middle of the top and goes down almost to the bottom. So it almost becomes a line along which you can imagine folding the painting, but it doesn't. But you don't finish the line at the bottom. So the bottom fifth of the center of the painting is where the fold line goes away. So you can't, like, you almost want to play. You want to like, I can't think of that thing at the back of Mad Magazine, but you have to fold the back. That you have to fold it to see. That's another level on which I feel like you've made a situation with that is a whole, a WHOLE, that has in it the way the parts work within the whole give me the feeling that in order to fully engage it, I meant to reach out and actually do things. Between the interplay of the flatness and the urge to fold, and the rounded natural quality of the collaged leaves and the totally abstract, brighter, more artificial quality of the green diamonds. Push pull. It's funny, 70 years after Hans Hofmann, the push pull is still like that's when painting gets. That's the point at which the painting becomes something in the world that you have to negotiate. Like, you have to deal with it as a body, as a thinking observer. You don't just look dumbly at this thing. It's not about an inert object on the wall. It's about something towards which you are made to have a feeling. I want to, because I'm mindful of time, but there's something that also came up while you were talking, when you were talking about Armstead and Marina. Could we go back to the first view of that work? And you were talking about the love in the house. Could you just talk about the relationship between colors, love, painting, what you can do, what you can know, what you can't do, what you can't know, history, slavery, existence? Go.
Yeah. I'm conscious of the limit to which someone might be able to engage kind of the layers of history, and also, of course, my relationship. But what I do trust is that there's a building that's visible that implies, that there's a house visible. that's somewhat in disrepair. And for me, kind of allowing myself to kind of meditate on, kind of to visually meditate on this site, and to almost build a kind of narrative that yields a particular process of responding to the house. So the palette in some ways is a very kind of childlike, from maybe a standpoint of innocence, not childish,
Right.
kind of the serious play of a child. But that the process of thinking about this site differently means that that I approach it with the kind of pleasure of a child coloring, or to first just shift the reading of this kind of gray as having a different kind of energy or life, and so the pink seems to be one way of doing that.
Yeah.
But it still allows you to kind of see the edges. And then these other moments become maybe the implication of adding a landscape, kind of like further bringing ornament to the landscape, whether it's a reference to the sun shining, or making the trees green, or an indecision about what to add next.
Yeah.
But for me, allowing myself to tap into a process that reflects this transformation that I want to happen for me as the descendant of the people who lived in this house. And then maybe for the viewer, that there is this implication of a kind of pleasure, not fussy, not overly refined in terms of maybe some conventions of drawing, but kind of acted upon in this way that has energy and is kind of charged from an energy standpoint.
Yeah.
Is how I'm thinking about it.
That makes a lot of sense. I love how you talked about the play that's going on with the idea of, especially with the idea of introducing new landscape elements. It's like as that's done, or as you do that, it's confined to the area of the imagination. Like it's not it's not happening to such an extent or in such a way that it feels like a restoration project or a recovery, or an attempt somehow to alter the actual reality of the site. It's as though the necessity that it can only be imagined, that kind of work can only be done by and in the imagination. Like that seems to be acknowledged in a very forthright way, without in any way suggesting that, well, that's all we can do, so we better enjoy it. It doesn't have a kind of it doesn't feel like a demonstration of limitations. It feels like an exploration of possibilities, or an exploration of a space in which we know limitations exist, but we don't experience those limitations as defining all of what is possible. Now, at this point, I've probably started using my own language for what you were saying in your own idiom. Like, have I hijacked your image? Does it feel like I hijacked your image?
I don't feel that.
Okay, good.
It does. It still feels like a conversation in which I'm interested in your read, but I'm also not willing to compromise how I'm thinking about what the image is.
Of course not. Of course not. That's what I was checking. I was checking for, because I've gotten to a point in my own career as a professional, whatever I am, interpreter. I don't make art. I never have. I never really even tried. And so I'm very aware that I am not. I work very hard in my work to remember that I am not the artist. I'm speaking as someone who does not have any idea of what it's like to do what has been done, but cares very deeply to understand what I can about what I'm being shown, within the constraints that the object itself has set.
Mhm.
Before we go, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the project that you have positioned at the Fullerton CTA stop by DePaul University, where you've taken a phrase from earlier work, "This blackness is just for you," and adapted it in ways that are thinking about the relationship between the word black, the ideas of blackness that we have socially and that we construct culturally and institutional stuff today.
I was really excited by the site for many of the reasons that you mentioned, but also an opportunity to revisit work and to further expand the kind of conversation that the work evokes. So I showed in my presentation the text painting, "This Blackness is Just for You," and the varied responses to that is what I love about language and what I love about this kind of text as image. And so for those to whom that text points to a kind of visibility where one might be otherwise underrepresented, kind of, I see you, we're seeing one another, and whatever the potential feeling of solidarity or just not feeling as marginalized, those kinds of readings. But also from the standpoint of a kind of blackface, a kind of showcase of a certain kind of blackness to be consumed. I'm also really interested in that. And again, in kind of introducing a kind of narrative around complicity. How might you be participating for whatever motivation in these kinds of frameworks? The reward for that, the reward for a particular kind, like seeing through a particular kind of display of a kind of blackness. So in this exhibition that faces the Fullerton stop, there's an opportunity to continue to shift one's relationship to that phrase and to add, to further build upon the readings of humor, or the kind of calling out that, calling out on the perception of a kind of alliance, thinking about the popularity of these Black Lives Matter signs and what that points to in terms of protecting property or legitimately speaking to solidarity. Those are the kinds of things that led to me viewing this as an opportunity to play with a kind of blackness, and for as slippery and as malleable as the term can be. So there's an opportunity to be really funny, but also to maybe challenge the institution and how they commit to, anti-racist, initiatives, or the trending popularity of certain kinds of diversity initiatives that also flatten histories of different peoples. And so those are the things that I think that work points to. And I think I'm most excited about it as a different entry point to that conversation. Whether one feels really challenged by the text or threatened by the text or called out by the text.
Yeah. I think we probably are at the point in time at which we should open up to Justin.
Yes.
And let him pose some of the questions that the students have sent in.
Oh, first of all, watching that, thank you both so much. Watching, I realized what a difficult request we made of you both, because it's like, Ayanna, like, hey, will you share some new work with someone you don't know while it's being recorded? I mean, how cruel are we? I mean, that's so I thank you for that, the willingness to do that. And then the same to you, Darby. I really appreciate it, because again, like, will you come discuss work that you had not seen of someone you're just, becoming familiar with? So I appreciate the generosity that you've both shown. I really appreciate it. I do have a few questions that students submitted beforehand that I'd like to ask of you. So first, for Ayanna, or a student wrote, why did you come back to painting at this moment? What can you express now that you couldn't before? In the process of relearning painting, what new discoveries are you making?
Well, having worked quite a bit in a very direct fashion in my performance work, in appropriating text and kind of intervening in text, there's something about the discrete form of painting that has been a really exciting space to revisit. And I'm as interested in the unapologetically interested in palette as I am what I'm doing with painting. And I think the kind of the lead up to other works have been have been message driven in a particular kind of way, which is very exciting for me. But there's something about expanding my approach to questions that painting seems right now a better complement to how I'm thinking about what's important to me and what I want the work to do. So I'm really in tune with the kind of solidary act of painting in the studio, as opposed to sometimes collaborating. The different kinds of publics that my work has invited because of the form the work has taken is shifting a bit to having a conversation in sometimes a more conventional space. I'm interested in my work kind of living in different contexts, and so it's been really, really lovely, particularly during this pandemic time and times to kind of think about my relationship to my work, to do it with this process that has a different kind of speed and a different kind of consideration, not more consideration, but a different kind of consideration.
Thank you. And Darby, there's a question for you from one of our students. When you're writing about artists and really spending a lot of time focused on their work, do you ever find yourself feeling a personal connection to the subjects? And I think what they're asking is, do you find yourself getting very personally connected to the artist, and how do you separate that from your interpretation and presentation of their work?
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, I mean, I move in my writing. I move between subjects that are alive and subjects that are dead, and in terms of the creators of the artworks, but also the other cultural texts that I deal with. If I'm dealing with the work of someone who is alive, whether they are an artist or not, if it's possible to be in touch with them, I try to be in touch with them. And that always opens one up to, all of the realities of an interpersonal relationship, So if I'm in touch with an artist, yeah, I'm being affected. How much of an effect that has is a much harder thing for me to track, especially to generalize about. I've been doing it for 21 years, so it's been different every time I've done it. But there have been plenty of times where I've found myself writing about like living subjects, people with whom I'm in contact in the process of writing, who intend, or I would like to reach farther into the writing process than I'm comfortable having others reach. And I've had to negotiate that by by different means according to the relationship. Like there's no one way to handle that, because not everyone is comfortable being shut out, you know. Like, well, you're writing about me, I should have a, you know, why did you speak to me if you didn't want to like listen? Well, of course, that's reasonable. Like what listening looks like in terms of how the words that I put forward reflect conversation and observation and so forth. You know, that's something that doesn't proceed according to rule, but it's a factor, and it's something that I have to deal with. I so far I've had really good luck, though. I mean, like by and large, artists who are being written about are grateful for being written about, you know, for being written about, and you know, it's that doesn't mean they always like what I have to say, but like sometimes it's not about the specific words as much as it is about, you know, knowing that somewhere people are talking about it, or somewhere people are reading about the work, like somewhere people heard that a text exists and maybe they did a Google and they went to the show and they had their own thing that has nothing to do with me. I try to focus on that part. Yeah, there's plenty of dirt under the fingernails. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Unfortunately, we're about out of time. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. This is our last presentation in this fall's Visiting Artist Series, but please mark your calendars because we'll be back in the spring with Misty Gamble, a ceramicist, who will be talking about her work on February 16th. And thank you again for joining us.